Welcome everybody to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I'm absolutely delighted today to welcome Gordon Knott to the show. Gordon Knott is a survivor of the British boarding school system and was sent away to school when a ban on corporal punishment in private schools was still 25 years away. The British Empire was slowly crumbling, and Elon Musk was 4 years old. At school, he was more interested in his record collection than getting to university, and subsequently spent a disproportionate amount of time in record shops and working in creative industries, before getting to 30 years old and realising he needed therapy. He trained and qualified as a counsellor and has spent the last 30 years working in the charity sector, mainly focused on children and young people's mental health. Welcome, Gordon.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for the invite. Lovely to be with you.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's lovely to connect. How I like to start the podcast is just to sort of check in with how we connected, which I think was via Thurston Bassett, and who's those who don't know him, a sort of prolific boarding school survivors sort of advocate, and was involved in writing one of the key books with Nick Duffell, but also your work with Boarding School Survivors South.
Yep. Yeah. So it's a really good connection with Thurston Bassett, who was one of the first mental health social workers in the early 70s, and he's been a real pioneer for the voice of the patient and advocate for the community ever since. That was our original connection, and he'd set up a group on the South Coast that met in Brighton before the pandemic. Then we've picked it up post-pandemic to meet quarterly, called ourselves Boarding School Survivors South. So for anybody living in Kent or Sussex or Hampshire, or anybody within radius of Brighton, we meet quarterly on a Saturday morning, have a few speakers, cup of tea and biscuits together, and have a conversation, getting some mutual support, a bit of networking, and it just gives an opportunity to me on a more regular basis than wait for the Boarding School Survivors Conference, which is usually in November every year. So a bit more of a local take on it.
Oh, thanks for sharing, and honour you for your work and in keeping that going post-pandemic, because we certainly see there's a real appetite for in-person get-togethers. Obviously, there's a number of online groups and things out there, but nothing beats getting together in the flesh. You said quarterly. When's your next one?
So the next one is 29th of March, then the 5th of July, and the 4th of October. I think that's the right way around this year.
Mm-hmm. And if people want to come along, so that's 29th of March. It's in Hove. So we can put your email perhaps in the show notes today for people to get in touch.
Yeah, that's fine. I think on your resources page you've got a very healthy spread of the national picture in terms of. It's really heartening to see a lot of groups, springing up or existing right around the country, and it's on the Seen and Heard website, the regional group. So my details are on there as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you. So that's a good one out there, and we can perhaps talk a little bit more about how you found your way into that as we go through today. But no, I love to get into at the beginning is to understand a little bit about where you came from and kind of the early years stuff. I'm really fascinated into what shapes people, how their time was at school, the childhood, and then how that set them up for adulthood and their transition through to the work they do and things. So going back, how was life for you in your early years, in your childhood?
Yeah, so I was born in Brighton, so I've never strayed far from the South Coast. Well, why would you? Brighton, San Francisco, Sydney, they're all my favourite cities, so good place to live. So my name and my brother's name were put down at birth for boarding school. My father was boarding school. His father was a boarding school as well. In 1906, I think he went away. So it was kind of, a boarding family. I was in the private school bubble. I went to prep school, from the age of 4, and stayed in the private school system until I was 18. So I'm a real product of, independent school education, and one would say the pros and cons of that. I think it's, we had a very comfortable suburban middle-class life, but didn't know till later, we were just surrounded by other private school children. We didn't get to go and play football with the locals. And in fact, when the locals did see us home from school, they used to chase us and throw stones and try and knock us off our bikes. And then I guess I came to realise later, the divisiveness. And I think that's why I got into campaigning, for alternative, and because I realised how divisive the whole private school system it was and still is, and I didn't like it. I didn't like feeling a part of that 7% of children who are educated independently, and I would question also what it set me up for in later life as well. It's not quite the all-round education that the glossy brochures would have you believe.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. Yeah, we'll perhaps get into that a little bit more later on. But yeah, so sort of suburban middle class life, as you said, home, independent school, but day school to start with. And what were you into as a kid? What kind of a little one were you like?
Oh, in those days, give us a bucket and a spade and a beach, and you'd be happy for the day. Or go off and play in the woods, or build go karts out of old prams, and fairly innocent compared to I hate to get into that. It's not like it was in my day, because obviously there were problems with every generation, but it was a whole lot more innocent. And I think that was what was shocking about being sent away to school, is that the ties that had been nurtured and the bonding with my parents and the security I'd had, suddenly at boarding school, I went from 13 to 18 and being left there by myself, that was fairly brutal realization. That those ties were severed so with that much brutality almost. So it was kind of sink or swim, and I can very clearly remember we had 2 weeks grace, as most people did in those days, to get your bearings sorted. You were allowed to make mistakes, walk on the grass, stick your hands in your pockets, run down the cloisters without being told off. But after those 2 weeks, then you were subject to all the rules that everybody else is subject to. And I remember shutting down very quickly. I realised, that first night, finding myself in a dormitory full of 25 other boys, just wondering how on earth, what had just happened. But I shut down very, very quickly, and that was how I coped. In order to survive, I cut off my feelings, kept my head down. I was a good boy for most of the time. I tried to be a sacristan in the church. I tried to be a prefect. I tried to be in all the teams. I tried to be, just keeping under the parapet, basically, to get by. Obviously, after lights out, you were in the hands of the older boys, and obviously that we know that's not a healthy place to be. But yeah, that was my way of getting through, was to sit down and shut up, basically, and try and get through best I can. Developed, like you said in the intro, the taste for music, and that kind of distracting, the distractions that brought with it, especially in the sixth form, when you get tiny bit more privacy, and maybe you get to share a study, and we could have record players and have a bit more time to ourselves, because it was the ongoing. I know colleagues have written about this. It's the ongoing busyness. You're kind of busy. You're up at 7 o'clock. If you're not getting sent for a run around the hockey pitch at 7 o'clock, being punished for something, then you've got to go and clean someone's shoes or something, and then you're busy until lights out at 10 o'clock, and probably so knackered by that time that you're just going to crash out. Yeah, fairly harsh regime in those days.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Gordon. Yeah, it's so there's a few things that come to me there. When you mentioned coming from home and then feeling that kind of wrench of separation, it reminds me of the great presentation that Annie Power gave at the Boarding School Survivors Conference last year in November around attachment. I think you were there that day. We both were, and what she was really talking about is whatever attachment style you form before you go into boarding school, there's either a great rupture to that, or there is a doubling down on it, if you like. So if you were kind of avoidant and came from an avoidant family, a very sort of dissociated family from the emotional side of things, you're probably most likely to do okay in a boarding school because it's more of the same. The challenge, of course, is that it doubles down on that level of dissociation and detachment. Yeah, you correct me if I get my terminology wrong. But then, if you're securely attached, then there is a great rupture as you go in, as you lose that attachment, you realise you're on your own. So would you have put yourself in that camp, if you like?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yes. I would have. I was pretty securely attached. Um, I think the place that I was sent to, which is probably not unusual, is these were places where nobody loved us. I'm sure a lot of the staff were well intentioned. The majority of the staff were well intentioned and wanted to try and make your experience there as comfortable as possible. And it makes me laugh these days when they talk about boarding schools being a home from home. I don't think so. It wasn't in 1975, and even with duvets and rugs and mobile phones, it's still not the same as going home to your parents every night. So yeah, I did feel pretty alone, and very clearly from the beginning, it was clear that there was no love, there was no compassion. It was about performance and achieving and keeping your head down and getting on best you could without getting into too much trouble. Obviously, the whole range of boys there, because single sex also being a problem, because the only females we ever came in contact with was matron or the catering staff. Obviously, I didn't realise that until I was 18 years old and realised the world was full of 52% females and the whole mix of people around. So yeah, pretty bizarre. If you put it down on paper, I mean, I think no psychologist or psychotherapist has ever endorsed boarding school as a healthy way to develop children. I mean, I can understand if there's child protection issues or there's some safeguarding or there's a reason to keep children away from parents and in safe environments. I can understand that that's a very small minority. I can understand the case for institutional care or keeping children safe from their birth parents, but for the majority of children, the recipe is a very bizarre mix of in loco parentis to the extreme.
Yeah, I can really hear that. I think the when people are critical of boarding, if you like, the advocates and defenders of the system will always jump to a couple of responses. One of which is, but for the kids who not everyone has a safe, happy home life, which of course is very, very true.
Mm-hmm.
And boarding school provides the structure and the
Yeah.
safety and the appropriate adults and etc. that for people to grow and be nurtured with friends etc. And that was the reason I was sent to boarding school. It was exactly that. Home was chaotic. Mum was ill and an alcoholic, and dad was workaholic, and there was an aspirational element as well. So we weren't a boarding family. It was my dad had just worked hard and thought it was the right thing to do at the time, mainly because mum thought I should go. But there's a lot of that goes on. But I think with that challenge, of course, is that it can be a little bit out of the frying pan and into the fire. Because yes, there are all these sports activities, there are other kids around and all that, but certainly when I went, it was very much Lord of the Flies. It was pretty dangerous. It was, you were on red alert the whole time, watching out for danger, scanning for danger, etc. And I wonder if it hadn't been available as a lifestyle choice, if you like, for my parents to a certain extent, or an aspirational choice, whether they could have been supported in community as parents to have looked after me. And I think by always having that, it's a bit like private healthcare, isn't it? If you've got the ability to get out of the system by opting out and paying for private healthcare or paying for private education, that in loco parentis, that giving responsibility to others, it can be problematic, I think, for many. So I hear you.
Yeah, it's hard. Also, it's interesting, the Lord of the Flies analogy, because I've tried to stop using. That's how I used to describe, after Lights Out. But I read Rutger Bregman's Humankind: A Hopeful History, where he talked about. First he talked about survival of the friendliest rather than survival of the fittest, because actually when nomadic people started to settle down, they didn't really want to fight because they might die. So actually, you negotiate around land, or you negotiate around sharing food or whatever it is. So nice. I'm an optimistic person, so I like that kind of survival of the friendliest kind of helps. But also, he talks about the original story, which I don't think William Golding was aware of because it didn't happen in 1968, and Golding wrote it in the 50s, in the mid-50s, about when a group of boys did get marooned on an island for about 18 months, I think, and they survived by cooperation. And nobody died, and they looked after each other, and they were rescued. And I thought, that sounds a lot more hopeful. And if that was the real Lord of the Flies, then I wish that story could be, told more widely, because obviously the original certainly fuels the whole stuff around, what goes on after the lights out. It is survival of the fittest, and the strongest, and the bullies actually win. So yeah, you're trying to reframe that one in recent times.
No, thank you for sharing. I wasn't aware of that. I think the analogy sort of stuck because it was so apt. Perhaps with the author being from a boarding school background, it's very tainted with it, with his own experience, perhaps.
Absolutely.
But funny you mentioned the sort of survival of the friendliest, because actually that was my principal coping strategy, was to, similar to you, conformer, played in all the teams, tried to, I was, lower middle sort of academically and things like that, but tried to stay safe by constantly staying in with as many people as humanly possible, whether it be teachers or other pupils. So I became very chameleonic, became hyper vigilant around people's emotions, and I was a sensitive kid anyway. And I think a lot of the people I've spoken to who did find it difficult at boarding school would probably class themselves as sensitive people, sensitive people. So, but that really stayed with me: the people pleasing element, the hypervigilance of relationship, spotting signals, facial signals, things that might mean you were out of pocket, or you were going to be just the boarding school. You could just be abandoned. You could be sort of was it sent to Coventry or whatever the expression was, where you just, no one would speak to you, you'd be shunned. I had that a number of times. And did you come across any of that in your experience?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the whole range was, from physical brutality through to the very subtle psychological, like you said, ignoring people, not talking to them. And when you're in that closed environment, you're 24/7, you're living on top of each other, enormously powerful. And we're adolescents at that stage. We're developing, we're trying to figure out what the world is all about, and all the stuff around identity and all the normal existential angst that goes on with adolescence. And then you've got this kind of very closed single-sex environment at the same time. Very confusing. But yeah, the whole range of tools that would be used, and you'd have to navigate through. And I think the hypervigilance is a good way of putting it, because there was very little respite. You could get, I think, going to sleep probably finally, when everything was quiet, and you just kind of crashed out for a few hours, and then it was still all over again. And there is a definite overdeveloped sense of, being alert to what possibly could happen.
Yeah.
So I share that.
Yeah, I hear that. So I was a insomniac for decades after school. I think, particularly in my first prep school, 7 to 10, I had a bed by the door in the dorm for a couple of years, and not through any, ill intention most of the time, but people going to the loo, kicking your bed as they walk past because it's dark, all that sort of, the noise of matrons shuffling up and down in the corridor, back then puffing away and drinking sherry and bumping into things and all that sort of stuff. I just constantly waking up. So I still have that now. Absolutely, anything happens anywhere near me, and I'll wake up. So I tend to have to wear earplugs and things, and have done for decades. But yeah, that, like you say, you have a lack of sleep, and then you start again, and whatever beef with the other kids or masters or whatever was hanging around from the day before, begin again. And I think that in my coaching work, and in working with a lot of people who've been through the system, that sort of complex post-traumatic stress, that inability to escape the captivity that Joy Schaverien talks about in her ABCD, abandonment, bereavement, captivity, dissociation. The captivity is a real element. You talked about the pressure cooker and the need for achievement as well. How was that for you in your experience?
Performance, yeah. Yeah, I just stick with the dormitory for a second. I still sleep with my dressing gown on my bed because, something I always, if you had to escape, you had to get your dressing gown on and escape, not necessarily a fire alarm practice because it's only once a term, but actually, the dormitories used to get raided by other people. And if you were sleeping close to the door, your bed was the first one that went up. So there's always that kind of, just in case I need to escape, I've got to have my dressing gown on so I can put it on and, and escape, not just in my pajamas. So that stuff is still around, it's bizarre, but, it's still there for me. And performance related stuff. Yeah, obviously I was probably, lower middle academic achieving as well. And it was interesting, actually. I found my father's end of term reports from when he was away, and that was 1950. And the old school stuff around could do better, and it was all around that kind of stuff, and had a lazy term, and the kind of language that they used, very dismissive, very punitive, and obviously we used to get punished a lot, from the subtle kind of being excluded to the 100 lines for doing this or detentions or whatever. So it's very intricate systems that you had to operate within. So many rules on every level, in the main house, in the classrooms, in the dining room, in the house itself, in the main school, the chapel. Everything had a set of rules to it, and trying to navigate your way through those, certainly for the first 2 years, was a nightmare because you would get punished if you walked across a little bit of grass or looked at the prefect the wrong way or something. So, learning to be, I think I picked up that kind of that kind of wanting to be rebellious, but also being deferential to authority. And I think, that's in my later career, working in mental health and being in some of the big meetings with the NHS and trying to learn the language of the NHS. And for years, I felt totally deferential to, these authoritative figures who did speak a different language and certainly looked like they had the authority. And I bowed down to it. And it's, only fairly recently that I've learned to actually, find my voice, I suppose, and actually say, hang on a second, is that right? Or can I just ask a question? Or even can I just understand what the acronym means? Because, the language you're speaking, I don't understand it. But so that stuck with me, for ages. It's kind of deferential, way of not challenging status quo, because the status quo of the institution is so powerful, and you'd get punished if you challenged it. So I guess we did it safely behind the study doors, and you listen to the new Sex Pistols record or something. That would feel like a form of rebellion, or one way of getting back slightly against the system.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Actually, you brought up a couple of things that really hit me. That the dressing gown brought back stuff for me about slippers and tuck boxes and God knows what else. The imposter syndrome that so many ex-boarders talk about. You say, always feeling, coming from perhaps those reports. I'd love to talk about reports a little bit, but also the authority of the institution, etc., left me with a legacy of hierarchy, respecting hierarchy, bowing down to authority, always feeling that I was going to get caught out at any moment, that I shouldn't be in the room, etc. And I know many of my clients, many other people I speak to, being through the system, felt the same. And when I looked at my stepdad's reports from the early 60s, I think, and he went from 8 to 18, and then I looked at my reports from the early 90s, and there was virtually no difference, except some of mine were typed, and his rule handwritten with quill, fountain pen, but it was all the same stuff. A ranking in each class, 9 out of 10 or whatever it might have been. Lazy term, must try harder. The only time he really equips himself is X, Y, or Z. And I saw one from my senior school the year that my mum died of a brain tumour. So I was 14, and it said, so paraphrase, but it was along the lines of, Chris hasn't really shown up this term. His mind has been elsewhere, and that has affected his studies. And it's like you just think, what do you do with that? It's absolutely brutal. But still, in each of those, in that report, where I was placed in my set, where I was placed in my year, etc. And I think I just remember a knot in my stomach at the end of every term when you thought the report was going to hit home. Because often then came the, do you know how much this cost me, and the sort of extra stuff that comes with it. But
no compassion, no recognition that actually you just lost your parent, you lost your mum. This is a kind of criticism that you didn't have your eye on the ball. I found my father's end of term from Michaelmas term 1949, end of his first term, he'd just gone away. And the housemaster report said something like, done fairly well considering the change in circumstances, which I guess is meaning the shift from living at home to living in school. But there's no leeway, is there? In kind of you kind of expected to, just buckle down and get on with it. And I guess that was because at that time also we were still being bred for the empire. We were due to join the clergy or the political system, or to be posted to a hill fort in northern India, and there the only way to survive, presumably, is to not have emotional awareness. You shut down and do the job of empire building for the mother country.
Yeah, and in order to do some of those colonial things that we did all over the world, you have to have a level of dissociation, and just be willing to follow orders blindly, etc. So it was that. Charles Spencer, isn't it? The emotionally cauterized soldiers of empire. It does track, and I know I know many people who are going through the system now, or they're teachers in the schools, and you'd certainly hear a lot about it all being better now, and I do see a lot of improvements, but ultimately particularly in safeguarding improvements, it's not perfect. It is better. Punishments and order is not put in the hands of the older pupils, as much as it used to be. DBS checks, etc., etc. And then there's the carpets, the nice facilities, the Wellbeing buildings, etc. And I do welcome the borders that are there at the moment are not going through what we others went through. The one challenge though that remains is, a number of challenges. You talked about the pressure cooker. We still hear a lot about that people are burning out, the kids and the teachers are burning out on these 70, 80-hour school weeks, and so huge amounts of eating disorders, bullying, self-harm, etc., suicidal ideation, suicidal stuff. There is no love. You mentioned that really clearly right at the start. There is no appropriate touch. It can be a warmer environment and a safer environment, but ultimately there isn't that love and touch. There isn't a huge amount of privacy. Still, I mean, they have toilet doors, which they don't have to bathe in front of a queue of boys like we perhaps had to.
Absolutely.
But there are still these inherent challenges, and I think there is still also with those the emotional intelligence, the understanding of emotion. Emotion coaching, etc. That's still not very much at the heart of it. It's still about academics, extracurricular. Do you have a view on how you see things now and how things have changed?
As you say, and engaging with boarding school organisations like your own is really important, and actually having the conversations and keep pushing the agenda, because the emotional wellbeing agenda and the whole mental health agenda is relatively new in terms of its velocity. Corporal punishment in public schools was only abolished 26 years ago. So really, the kind of emotional wellbeing agenda in private in boarding schools is probably only 15 to 20 years old. So relatively new. Ofsted coming in and checking and being more brought into line with minimum standard regulations and stuff. Still relatively new. I guess it's within a generation, which is a good thing. Yeah, I kind of and I don't want to say keep harking back to the old days, because when I went away in 1975, that feels like something out of Charles Dickens. But I think the bit that we don't want to lose is actually, because we know there are a significant number of thousands of children under the age of 11 in boarding schools, and actually, can that be healthy? And we know that also, we survived the Harry Potter hype, and people got excited around going to boarding school because they thought it was all Harry Potter. But also, you'd probably have to give me some scientific backup on this to get the figures. But the post-COVID stuff, where actually a number of parents realised that actually having the children living at home wasn't a bad thing. So actually, can we correlate the numbers going down? Maybe because people discovered that actually, you know, why not live with a teenager at home instead of sending them away?
Mm.
And also not to underestimate the movement that we've all been involved in, the last 25, 30 years, where we've seen a stack of books being published, and obviously Bordering on Insanity has just been released as well. This is groundbreaking stuff. And, that you can't underestimate, now sticking a term on it, the boarding school syndrome, having that recognized by mental health professionals and other professionals as a syndrome or as a diagnosable effect, boarding school, has all helped, I think, to kind of just raise the issues and either make people think twice about sending children away to boarding school, or certainly if you are going to send them away, let's think about the pastoral care more closely. Let's think about the mental health aspect to it as well, and the effect of performance burnout on children, because they are very high achieving aspirational places. And you look at the brochures and it is like a country house hotel with all the facilities. But you're also talking about, children being given the opportunities, which is fabulous. But actually, to take advantage of those opportunities, you've got to be working really long days. And also, let's be honest around the charitable status as well, because speaking as a generalization, I'm sure there are pockets of good practice, but these institutions with the fabulous resources do not share them with the community. They do not adhere to some of the rules around charitable status, which I thought was around encouraging and sharing with the community and being more outreaching. It's predominantly for the paying customer, which is, the parent of the child, who are, consider putting them in boarding schools a way to giving them a serious leg up in life, which we know the figures are. The disproportionate amount of ex-independent school pupils who are in very influential positions. The number of prime ministers who went to Eton, for example, 26 or something like that. But actually, and then that opens the other debate is around, harking back to Nick's book, Wounded Leaders, the kind of quality of these men who are in positions with no emotional awareness at all, never done any work on themselves, and they're, making these huge decisions on behalf of the rest of us.
Mm.
Maybe that stuff's shifting slightly. I'm sure there are less public school, boarding school people in the current cabinet than there used to be. But actually, this is all still within recent memory, and a lot the damage has been done as well, haven't they? These are performance related, driven individuals, but they're not well rounded. They don't have the kind of the emotional bit, which we know, and I think that's when you talk about, what did you leave school with? I think I spent years trying to get back to that place of emotional vulnerability, being able to admit vulnerability, because you sure as hell couldn't do that at school. And yet, we know that admitting vulnerability, especially as being a senior leader or in a management position, is crucial. It doesn't mean that you're saying to your staff, I'm going to collapse and I can't do the job anymore. It means actually that you're saying, I'm not Superman. I don't have superpowers. We need to make a team effort around this. I can't do this individually. Whereas previously we kind of bottled it all up and, tried to press on. When my father died, all my hair fell out, and is 6 weeks later. And I took that as a sign that actually that was how much stress I was containing within myself. I didn't express myself, in terms of the grief I felt after his death. So it comes out somewhere. And that was a really vivid reminder that actually you can't keep everything bottled up forever.
Mm. Well, thank you, Gordon. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And yeah, I can resonate with a lot of that through the most key stress periods of my life. My hair went white. I developed all sorts of autoimmune conditions, rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, fibromyalgia, and this was when my son was dying, when, my marriage was collapsing, when, so the body keeps the score. And I see the picture behind you, back left, is the front cover of, well, it looks similar to the front cover of Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, the image.
On the shelf.
It just reminds me of it. And,
Yeah.
and yeah, you're absolutely right. It will get you, it will come outside some way, sideways. And I think the repression of emotion was a key feature for me personally, and many others. And you touched on the wounded leaders part. Obviously, the Piers Cross Boarding on Insanity film that touches on, obviously, Piers' experience of boarding school syndrome, but then looks at the wounded leaders aspect of the amount of senior people in positions of power across the world who came through the system. And it references that the single biggest determinant of life success, not just measured by money, is emotional intelligence. It is the if you look at if you just Google or chat GBT, 7 characteristics of a great leader or something like that. I went through them for the Nicky Campbell boarding school radio show, and you just go through and you think, no, this is not what was being taught. My suspicion is it's still very academic. It's my knowledge is it's still very academic, very sport driven, and very extracurricular. But we're very passionate, talking to schools, talking to the Boarding School Association, others, trying to get a way in to talk about welfare, well-being, and emotion coaching. Because ultimately, whilst young people are still at boarding schools, if that were to ever change, that'd be a different story. But whilst they're there needs to be an understanding that actually, if they're going to set up for success in many ways, as great leaders, but as human beings who are happy and well-rounded, we've got to get a conversation about emotions, and recognizing vulnerability being a superpower and not a dirty word.
And bringing that emotional vulnerability into all your relationships, not just as leaders of industry, but actually into your personal relationships and your peer relationships, and how crucial that is. And I think just going back to what you said about repression, certainly for myself, going to school at that time, I repressed all my feelings around attraction towards same sex, and obviously being in the same sex environment for that amount of time was a blessing and a curse, because if one was discovered to be accommodating colleagues, let's say peers, then tremendous shame and casting out and name calling, and you'll be branded, and being gay was a real criticism, and a real branding that happened to a number of people. And I saw that happen, obviously tried to steer clear of that. So for me, this very strange, another thing to navigate besides the hundreds of rules. You also had to, as I talked about, finding your identity as an adolescent, and sexuality being one of the key parts of your identity. I had to keep that very secret. And it's not until 45 years later I'm able to say now I'm a gay man. But I've spent most of the time in my life in heterosexual relationships. I was unable at the time to come out because it's 1980, so it was pretty hostile anyway, and I was unsure on finding my feet. And I think, it was a safer bet, I suppose. I didn't have the courage to take that step. But there's a cost. And there's the cost that you see, that I've been not necessarily unauthentic in relationship, but certainly never been the true self that I could have done when I was, 15, 16, and quite clear that in those days, being attracted to the same sex. So there's another manifestation, I suppose, of, coming out literally 40 odd years later.
Well, thank you for sharing, Gordon, and just honour you deeply for making that decision and coming out and living the life that you want to live. I think when you talk about the great shame of being gay at school, that was still, I went through a couple of decades after you, I think, and still the greatest ostracizing that ever happened to me at school was around that. It was because I put my arm around a friend of mine because he was struggling with something that was going on at home. A couple of the other guys saw me put my arm around him, and I was called gay boy, gay lord, and no one could speak to me for, I think it was about 3 or 4 months. Anyone who spoke to me would basically catch it,
Yes.
and that was really deeply troubling. I was around sort of 12 years old, 11, 12. And then I massively overcompensated. After I was sort of allowed back in, I made sure then that I sort of chased the girls, because I was in a co-ed school at that point. I chased the girls around, ruthlessly, because to try and disprove this idea that I was gay. And I think in a mixed school, the girls were almost expected to pair off with the boys. There was a patriarchal sort of unwritten rule that, it wasn't whether you wanted a boyfriend, it was just pick one. You got to pick one. And that led to some of my first sort of, sexual encounters at school with girls being awful, two frightened young people trapped in a music room, expected to kiss, to, whatever. And I still remember the first girl I kissed, just looking into her eyes, she was like a scared rabbit. And, neither of us could do it. We're just two scared young people who were sort of being forced into it. So there's a very unhealthy, view of sexuality, femininity, masculinity. It wasn't healthy at all.
No, I mean, the adolescent sexuality stuff is clumsy enough already, but in that environment, and we were in one of the podcasts that followed the Boarding and Sanity release, and one of the women was talking about, abuse of female boarding school pupils by the males, who were obviously desperate to prove their heterosexuality, whatever it is, but actually in a number of recorded instances of girls being abused and assaulted. And it's just a very strange pressure cooker, isn't it, of stuff. And I'm not saying this stuff doesn't not go on in state schools, because obviously adolescents are in different situations. But when you've got this kind of isolated community where it is unique, and it is removed, and often it's miles from anywhere in the middle of the countryside, it's a potential, well, as we know from the amount of abuse and child molesters that were prevalent and probably still are in these institutions, not healthy places.
No, thank you. It's something that's still a very much an ongoing conversation campaign around safeguarding. At the moment, there's a lot of obviously media and things around the independent inquiry into child sex abuse recommendations, the 20 that Yvette Cooper has said, will happen. We've been very outspoken campaigners for mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse. And some of those things would have protected many, institutions over the years. But they weren't there. And sadly, the abuse rates that we see in Stephen Head for people coming for support are 10 times, 8 or 10 times the sort of the national average, the numbers.
So when boarding schools say things have changed, let them publish the figures. And when we see, safeguarding concerns or reports of safeguarding concerns decrease, when we see perpetrators no longer being found out and imprisoned, that's the proof, isn't it? When it actually stops.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the two big conversations we're having with the industry, if you like, that's still there at the moment is taking welfare and wellbeing seriously, not making it a tick box exercise for the marketing prospectus. And the other one is there has to then be some sort of truth and reconciliation, understanding that if you're saying it's all better now, you're really saying it wasn't okay then. And there are these generations of people who've been through when it was a lot worse, who may well need emotional support, who may well need, to heal as adults. And that could be 30s, 40s, 50s, up to, we have people coming in their 80s, coming into awareness for this stuff. And there's no ownership of that. as an industry, if you like, that there are, if you like, damaged consumers
Absolutely.
in business terms. So I would like to see improved welfare and well-being and safeguarding now, but I would also like to see a level of ownership for helping those who went through the darker days, if they want to call them that, to heal.
Because when you talk about UK PLC, something we are really good at in this country is our institutions keeping secrets. The John Smythe stuff just coming out of the Church of England, the boarding schools, wherever you want to turn to.
Yeah, Royal Mail, blood scandal, scouts,
Yeah,
etc. That goes on and on, doesn't it?
we've decades of history in keeping secrets and perpetrating abuse. I was really interested in the last bit of the Nicky Campbell series that he just had on Radio 4, because I thought the first two were really good, and I really felt for Nicky because he's obviously a survivor, and he has been the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry. He was abused, so I kind of felt for him in that position. Here he is trying to present a kind of a non-biased view for boarding schools, but
BBC impartiality thing, isn't it?
But I don't think he lost it in the last series because it was an advert for Millfield and Wellington, basically. And he said at the beginning that he tried to speak to a number of schools for this series, and obviously Millfield and Wellington took him up on that. But I was really interested. Well, what about the schools who turned you down? Why do they turn you down? Why are they afraid to come and talk about boarding schools now? You could only find 2 schools to talk to. So I was really interested in the ones who didn't want to speak to him. And even now, when they talk about more transparency and want to do things differently, why are you not talking to, Nicky Campbell, who was making a fairly BBC middle of the road documentary on the boarding school phenomena, which, has got a huge history and a big indentation into our, history of the last 150 years or so.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think I'm in this week and then next week I'm going to both of my old schools to visit and to speak to them about seen and heard and pupil welfare and well-being. And I wonder what it's going to be like to sit in the head's office where I was beaten as a 7-year-old, now going back as a 44-year-old and speaking to the current head. I wonder what the narrative will be, where the challenges are for the school, and how well-being is truly viewed. As you say, if there's only a couple who are willing to go on record about their sort of their track record and their well-being and welfare agenda, I wonder what's happening at the other schools who have less money, who have less profile.
Yes.
Report back.
Yeah, and I hope you have somebody safe to debrief with afterwards, because that could be pushing the button, couldn't it?
Yeah.
And I think the work that you're doing is brilliant, because I went to Nick Duffell's men's workshops in 1993, and in those days we were privileged whingers, and we were predominantly white men who were doing it. And what has changed is obviously organisations like yourself reaching out in different ways, but also books on women's experience have been published, and the meetings we have now are 50% women, which is fantastic. We no longer can be cornered into it's just you old white guys who are complaining about how it used to be in the 1970s. That's not the case anymore. We know we've got younger boarding school pupils coming through whose experiences, within the last decade or so, and even more recent than that. So it's changed, and the number of publications that have come out, and like I said earlier, George Schaverien, naming the boarding school syndrome thing, it has changed, and it will continue to change. And there's a really good momentum at the moment, I think, for some change, or certainly having the debate around it, less afraid to talk to the institution. I think you're exactly right. We need to talk to each other, and it's not about hunting down perpetrators from the past. That is important, but it is important about what's going for the future, because these places are businesses. They're franchised all over the world now. It's it's $1 billion industry. So in a way, that's not going anywhere. So we need to talk, like the whole mental health agenda with schools and community anyway. We need to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think you say, there are some really important things coming out this year, whether it's across this film, Nikki Moxie and Linda Devereaux new book, looking at the woman's experience, new chapters in Nick Duffell's new book due out in May. Toby Ingham's got a fantastic new book out.
Kathy Weald just written a new book.
Kathy's book's incredible. We'll be doing a giveaway on that next week, actually. So there's just more voices, more conversation, a better breadth of voices. But we've got to still keep going with that. We're running a series of podcasts on the female experience of boarding as well, just to try and hear all sides of things, all aspects, and I'd love to also do some podcasts with people who loved it, who say it was the making of them, and because I truly believe that there has to be a rounded debate, because for some people it worked.
Yeah,
it really did for some people, and I would still argue that there is a level of stuff they may not be willing to have a look at, but ultimately they weren't, or wouldn't say that they've been drastically harmed by the process. I think, so we see people from their 20s up to their 90s who are going, I wonder if, I wonder what happened there. Was that okay? Was that, how's that affected me? But back to your story, Gordon, with what you came out of your early years with, and we know that you obviously got into working in the charitable sector. What do you think drove you into the work that you did as an adult? What was pulling you forward?
So when I left school at 18, I was shell shocked. I can remember I just wanted to come home, and so I did. I moved back home for the first year after boarding school, just really to kind of go, what the hell was that all about? Can I have my front door key back now, please? And can I just live at home with mum and dad for a bit? So I needed to do that for a year. Totally shell shocked. Came out with this very brittle self-opinion, quite arrogant, but very unexplored at that stage, and kind of stumbled, I think, for the next 10 years. And I worked in the theatre and dance company and music industry, and I was just having a nice time, going to loads of gigs and clubs and just, kind of floating around till, like you said in the intro, hit 30, string of fairly broken relationships. Met a fantastic person who I've lived with the last 32 years, went into therapy, and I was at that stage. I was teaching young people in a further education college how to DJ, and I got more interested in the stories they were telling me than the records they were playing. I thought, how can I, progress this? So I went and trained to be a counsellor, so I could, so I could do it, so I could be in the position to, listen to people. And I remember in my first 6 weeks of training thinking, this is great, I can put myself on a pedestal, I get to dispense wisdom, and all the rest of it. But I very quickly realized that actually you have to get alongside. And I went into therapy for 10 years, and I just started that process, and I just really enjoyed, getting alongside people and like I said earlier, seeing through the divisiveness of the private school system and wanting to do something about that. And there was times, also, as you said earlier, there was times of imposter syndrome. I was thinking, when I was a CEO of a charity in South London, thinking, public school, middle class, white boy, what am I doing here? How did I get here? And obviously it's, there's more depth to it than that. But there was certainly moments like that. But, I when I came out of school, and eventually I got to meet so many lovely people and realised the world was very, very different to the one that I'd been brought up in. Where I was taught that women were slags and boys were hooligans, and, we were to propagate the class structure and go forth and, conquer peoples across the world. I just kind of rejected all that quite quickly. And I guess that's what I spent my career trying to do. And mental health and emotional well-being has been, part of the vehicle to do that. And, I love working with communities, love working, with people who've been disenfranchised, and advocating, against disadvantage, and, doing what I can from a relatively entitled and privileged position. I understand that for myself, about how can I use that influence and that position to, do something different.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Gordon. Amazing work. You're so right there. I've heard it a few times now. I think Giles Moffat mentioned it really well, and some of the speaking he was doing about that education and being articulate, whether with words or spoken word or whatever it might be. Actually, once someone who's got those wounds has done the healing work and stays on that, it's not ever a done thing. We'll all be healing till there are no more tomorrows. But you put those two together, that can be very powerful to advocate for people. Putting that education plus opening the heart, coming from a heart-centered place after doing the healing work, then suddenly, wow, you're onto something there. So, thank you for your work, and with the Boarding School Survivors South, is that just a passion for you, just to keep getting people connected and bring them together?
Yeah, absolutely. I never stopped being, kind of fascinated by this. Well, shocked and fascinated in equal amount sometimes. So I read recently in 2005, 52 private schools had been brought up by the Office of Fair Trading because they set up a cartel to fix the prices. So I kind of got interested in the story, and what I did, I looked at all their Latin mottos and the complete irony of some of these. I mean, I might turn it into a bigger piece of work. I'm certainly going to present it at the next Boarding School South meeting. But actually, I wish I'd written some of them down. But the motto from Marlborough is "God gives the increase." The motto from Radley is I've got it written down. Or wise as serpents, innocent as doves. And when you think about this in a price-fixing cartel, it totally fits. And obviously, Eton is Floreat Etona, isn't it? Long live Eton, of course, because they look after themselves and try and fix prices. But then I took it a step further, and quite clumsily, but quite crudely, I just typed the name of the boarding school and the word abuse. And I do not lie when I tell you 92% of those schools, something was on the internet about some abuse that happened at school. That's the deeper story. That's the shocking story. I can make a bit of a joke, and they did get fined from the Office of Fair Trading, and there was a case for them to say that actually they didn't know the rules, so they didn't feel they were acting inappropriately. But the deeper story is actually when you type in and look a bit deeper, their histories, 92% of them had something around abuse, that they'd suffered. So, there's a reality check for us tonight. So I'm kind of still passioned up and curious to keep the thing going.
Yeah, keep having the conversations and asking the uncomfortable questions, and for me, advocating for young people. I think in this country it's been a bit of a throwback, from our colonial past maybe, but young people are not are treated very poorly, I feel, and kind of looked down on. You should be seen and not heard. That's where our name came from, and or whenever they speak out about things, they're criticised as being snowflakes, etc. And it doesn't feel remotely right to me. Many cultures revere young people as being much closer to the divine, to God, because they have so much to teach us, and they haven't had all the wonderful parts of their personality chipped off them by the system yet. So, whether it's private education or state education, there is a job to do, I feel, to advocate for young people, and maybe emotion coaching, and just I did a podcast with a suicide prevention expert, Harry Mansfield, the other week, and we're just talking about the fact that why does no one train you to understand or use your mind?
Mm-hmm.
Surely that seems a very useful thing to do, given it will be the difference between you fulfilling your potential or not. It won't be how much Latin you got down your grade 8 at the recorder. It will be how to understand yourself and how to relate to others will be the key determinant of your life path to success.
Absolutely. And in response to the snowflake criticism, a stack of snowflakes all together, it's a blizzard. And you try and stop that. That's a really powerful metaphor. It's like when they get together, don't write them off as individual snowflakes. That's ridiculous. See them as a blizzard coming. And one of the things I say to my daughters is, if they're leaving the house in the morning, I'll say, work hard and change the world. And I guess that's a message for me as well. But actually, that's the next generation, isn't it?
Beautiful. Well, that might be a wonderful way to start to wrap things up for us today, because I know we're coming to time. But yeah, that's a great, and just thank you for your time today, Gordon. Your story, your views on the system, past and present, and your continued work to try and connect people, to tell stories, to and give people a space to heal with each other and connect with each other. It's on your work. Was there any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to sign off with? Anything to set the record straight? Or
do I have a list?
Well, let's have a think. Go on, let's have a couple of quick ones. So, what coaching would you give your teenage self if you could?
I'd probably say trust yourself, because generally things will work out okay. And generally, your parents are trying to do the best for you. You may not see it at the time, but generally speaking, they are trying to do the best for you.
Beautiful. And another one I'd like to ask is, what have you changed your mind on most in the last few years?
So, Joe Strummer, lead singer of The Clash, City of Freeman's, so public school, a border. In the Clash song 1977, they one of the lines was no Beatles, no Dylan, no Beatles, no Dylan, no Rolling Stones. And I believed that for years, and it took me years to understand that actually those artists were major components of their own record collections. But at the time, being an idealistic young man, I thought, sweep everything away, sweep everything pre-1977 away. And I guess as I've got older, I kind of realised that actually it's a lot more subtle than that. So don't wipe everything off completely. You know what I'm saying?
Much to learn. So much to learn. Yeah, from what's gone before. Keep an open mind. Beautiful words to finish. So, to find out more about Boarding School Survivors South, you can head to the Seen and Heard Regional Groups page, or we'll put in the, which I'll put in the show notes, but a way to connect to Gordon as well. We've mentioned a number of things today. The Piers Cross film, Boarding on Insanity, the book's coming out, Toby Ingham, Nick Duffell, Nikki Moxie, and others. So there's plenty to read about, get your teeth into, and we'll bring you more podcasts in the future as well with more wonderful people. So, but for today, thank you so much, Gordon, for your time and your energy and your work, and goodbye for now.
Thank you, Chris. Goodbye.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.